Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Alan, the marketing manager for AppViewX. I'll be your host for today. Our topic is Network Automation 102, Automate Your Network, and it's a direct sequel to our previous webinar, which you may have attended. Glenn Gray will be presenting. He's a senior solutions architect here at AppViewX. If you haven't heard of us before, we are a company that creates software used by network and security teams to automate, orchestrate, and secure and manage network infrastructure. Many of our customers are on the Fortune 500, and we have a presence in 7 countries across the globe, including the US, the UK, and India. Before we begin, I'd like to add that if you have any questions during the webinar, type them into the Zoom control panel at any time. I'll bring them up during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. With that, I'll pass it over to Glenn. Hello, Glenn.
Hi, thank you, Alan. Again, my name is Glenn Gray, Solutions Architect with AppViewX. And to cover the agenda for today, I'd like to start out with describing the traditional network change management processes, followed by design automation workflows, and thirdly, network automation use cases, and for the last point, the benefits of network automation. Now, in talking with many of our customers and prospective customers, we've gathered the basic primary drivers for network automation. Most are seeking to achieve agility, reduce costs, eliminate errors, ensure compliance, and gain a centralized management perspective of their application delivery and automation cycles. The basics of network automation consist of automation adoption processes. That's really the essence of the beginning. A recognizable change in the approach, the willingness to embrace the adoption of automation itself. And to do that, you'll want to identify and embrace what works best for your organization. You'll want to focus on what the overall business value and the end user experience. You'll want to break down and follow step-by-step systematic approaches to creating an automated orchestration sequence of tasks. And you want to measure those automation success at various stages. Now, some of those incremental approaches to reaching network automation are described here. And it initially begins with identifying the tasks. And what that means is identifying with each individual component or building block within the overall task sequence of application delivery and application management life cycles. You'll then want to segment those tasks, breaking them down into the individual puzzle pieces. You'll want to simplify and standardize those tasks so that they're highly repeatable, basically defining the inputs and outputs for each one of the incremental tasks, and then begin to associate those service tasks, fitting the pieces of the puzzle together in the necessary order of workflow processes that apply to your particular business or enterprise. And then you'll want to iterate through the automation processes, refining them, and ultimately leading to full orchestrated service infrastructure. I like to use an example when I describe this concept of the incremental approach. Taking apart the basic constructs of web application service deployments, most everyone would identify with, well, I have a fully qualified domain name, myservice.mycompany.com, and let's say that I have an infrastructure that is either data center centric, maybe cloud centric, maybe hybrid. a mixture of on-prem and cloud-related services. But whichever case, you can identify with, okay, I'm going to deploy this particular application, myservice.mycompany.com, in one or more locations. Let's say that it's multiple locations, and it's distributed perhaps in the East, Central, and West, or Data Center 1, Cloud Environment 2, and Data Center 3. You'll want to identify IP addresses for your service instances in those locations. So you're going to have to register those IP addresses with your IP address management utility. You're going to register the DNS name within your DDI system. You're also looking at potentially building high availability, meaning multiple pool members or multiple service instances to offer that particular service, that web interface. So you're creating a load balance virtual service instance in each of the data centers. And again, you're registering IP addresses. Perhaps you're using encrypted endpoints like HTTPS to service those web service applications. So you're registering or you're requesting a certificate signing and private key structure with a CA. You're also going to open up firewall and security policy parameters to allow traffic to flow in and out of the web service instances. And those are the incremental tasks that I'm referring to: the registration of the DNS entries, the registration of the IP addresses, the creation of the virtual service instances, the implementation, design of the security firewall policies, the request and retrieval of certificate instances. So when you take those fundamental basic building blocks of deploying your web application within your environment, those are the individual tasks that you'll want to identify, then begin to segment, simplify, standardize, and then orient into a highly repeatable workflow sequence. Now, how does the AppViewX platform help to facilitate this process of automation that I'm describing? The AppViewX platform supports a multi-vendor environment. So regardless of the mixture of vendor platforms within your infrastructure, AppViewX is capable of integrating with those multiple vendor ecosystems. It can even support hybrid data center environments, perhaps public, private cloud, on-prem, and so forth. It's also capable of interfacing or extending role-based access controls to individual technology skill sets. So in the case that you have application support members, network ops engineers, security ops, DevOps, PKI administrators, the AppViewX platform can extend to those individual technology skill sets the necessary rights, permissions, and visibility into your multi-vendor ecosystems so that you can orchestrate successfully and reduce the amount of time that it takes to not only deploy, but manage your application delivery and automation. Now, looking at traditional network change management to begin with, most companies experience longer implementation cycles from multiple days to weeks due to the complexities and siloed structures within their business environments. Oftentimes you have application owners or developers making request items through ticketing systems, which are then translated or processed or interpreted by multiple technology skill set contributors in the way of network operations, perhaps DNS administration, security operations, and so forth. And oftentimes those request items can be misinterpreted because the actual request item does not translate well into machine language or the actual implementation structure that you're going to apply as a configuration set within your infrastructure. So it's error prone, it's time consuming, it's susceptible to misinterpretation. But at some point, configuration, design structure, or syntax machine language is developed and then proceeds maybe towards an approval process and even secondary approval process before deployment. And even after deployment, sometimes the actual implementation does not meet the desired business need that was intended by an application developer or application owner. The network automation approach that AppViewX offers helps to streamline and offer the ability to integrate the multiple technology skill sets to again provide their individual expertise through the AppViewX platform, allowing each of these contributors to orchestrate their particular contributions and thus streamline through the entire process. It will integrate with ITSM platforms to facilitate change management, control, governance, ITSM related requirements, as well as the ability to communicate with the infrastructure itself to automatically generate the configurations, in a reliable, error-free manner, because they've been designed as highly reproducible tasks and then oriented into a sequence that is in line with the overall business objective. It will also allow for that escalation for review, and that's extended to the individual skill sets as well, so that each individual technology skill set can review what's appropriate for their expertise and their skills. And then finally, be able to push into the infrastructure itself, thus reducing the overall deployment times, administrative life cycles for application deployment down to moments. So the AppViewX platform offers the ability to not only deploy, manage the network infrastructure, but the ability to do discovery of your network components and then provide to you an intuitive, meaningful, application-centric view of your infrastructure. And what's depicted here in the caption number 3 is an example of an application instance where it's showing you how it's deployed across each component within your infrastructure to include the security firewall gateways, the load balance infrastructure, the parent DNS identity, the individual pool members, showing you availability with easy to understand green, red indicators, also associating the certificate and key structures. And this is automatically done through auto discovery with all infrastructure that is loaded into the management of the AppViewX platform. And the AppViewX platform communicates with the infrastructure over defined SSH or HTTPS RESTful API communication mechanisms that are inherent in each platform within your infrastructure. It also integrates with the external authentication mechanisms such as Radius, TACACS, LDAP, Active Directory, SAML, so that it relies upon the existing identity and access management structures that are already being used within your business or enterprise. So there's no need to identify unique authentication structures or redesign or tweak the existing IAM practices. So in addition to the discovery capabilities, it then enhances your ability to manage this multi-vendor and hybrid infrastructure. It's enabling business administrators, engineers, operators, and other skill sets to view the application-centric environment and identify historical events. As you can see in the caption 3 item on that timeline above the graphic representation of the application instance, you can see related log and alert events, or even configuration drift change events over time that relate to this particular application instance as it resides on each component within the infrastructure. You're also able to make changes to perhaps enable, disable state, regenerating, renewing, revoking certificate instances, even troubleshooting of from a device perspective of the application itself. You could generate queries to any component within the infrastructure, such as a firewall, load balancer, or other mechanism, maybe to view the route tables, to perform trace routes, to perform pings, to show ARP tables, any number of different shell-related or terminal-related tasks. And lastly, it enables your business to perform design and automation, or customized design and automation workflows. As depicted in the caption item number 3, it's showing a glimpse of the visual workflow palette, where on the left you'll see a library of built-in workflow routines or tasks. And the graphic depiction is showing the orientation of those workflow tasks that are simply drag and drop components and then linked together in the desired sequence to provide a complete workflow or orchestration, and thus leading to the automation of business-specific events. This is an example of an F5 Big IP virtual service creation where the application owner user provides some input detail for the desired application instance, and then it iterates through the necessary building blocks to complete a F5 Big IP virtual service creation instance. This example is depicting InfoBlocks integration, where it's reserving IP, integration with a ServiceNow instance for configuration item creation and change management ticket validation. Then onto the virtual server creation instance with the F5, again checking with the ITSM for validation purposes. Creation of the config, checking of the configuration and pushing, and then integrating with an approval process prior to the config push to the device, where you see at the very end, and then ultimately leading to the end of the workflow configuration design. Now, lastly, the automation component. Once individual service functions have been designed in the visual workflow palette, they're then available as individual catalog items in the service inventory. And those individual catalog items within the service inventory are then extended through the web user interface, through the REST API, to your consumer group. Your consumer groups can be defined and associated to existing LDAP Active Directory group structures. So again, in coordination with your existing IAM structures, you can assign the availability of any or all of the service requests within the catalog to the appropriate groups. So therefore, your DevOps team has the ability to perform application deployment requests. Your PKI team has ability to access and utilize certificate lifecycle management, renew, revoke, regenerate, push, bind. Your NetOps group has the ability to access the backup instances for your load balance infrastructure or firewall infrastructure to restore maybe a security policy definition or pool member definition or iRule definition. So let's look at some use cases. Some of the easiest low-hanging fruit as it relates to deploying automation or beginning to design automation typically are in the spaces of load balancing as a service or DNS as a service. You can enable common load balancer and DNS service requests through the self-service catalog that was offered through the visual workflow design palette. And that would allow the application owners and operations teams to harness, to embrace those well-defined workflow tasks or routines, and thus extending the load balance and DNS type components as a service. This would help to minimize the operational expense and maintain automation workflows regardless of the vendor or version. And it abstracts the actual workflow tasks into easy to understand and intuitive service catalog items versus multiple network operating systems across various vendor infrastructure components. And two of these easy to identify building blocks, such as virtual service creation or load balance service creation and DNS registration, are two components that lend themselves as entry points to building the first two steps in an automation sequence: creating a virtual service, reserving an IP. And what's depicted there in the graphic representation is a workflow sequence where it's identifying, creating a virtual service input, fetching and reserving the next available free IP from your DDI solution or IPAM solution, validating that the components are available, ready to deploy, and then processing through, if necessary, a needed approval, and then implementation and post-validation of the end service. That can also relate easily to security structures. So firewall as a service or web application firewalls as a service. Again, two components or two service tasks that are coupled together and share similar definition constructs. Again, a graphic representation of defining basic inputs that go into the security policy structure, and then sequencing through the implementation, which is the definition of the sequence tasks that were outlined and illustrated in the visual workflow palette a couple of screens back. So all of this leading up to the benefits of the network automation. It enables businesses and enterprises to move faster, enforce compliance, eliminate errors, and reduce costs. I'd like to open up for any questions that you may have. So if there are, please enter them into the chat. Alan, I think you can interpret and read off any. Okay, I have one question here. The question is, do workflows need to be initiated from AppViewX? No. We can integrate with other northbound interface mechanisms. An example of that would be ServiceNow. So because the AppViewX platform offers a RESTful API and publishes each of the visual workflow tasks that have been designed as an API request endpoint, you can structure your ServiceNow service catalog as a form front for collecting the input to initiate your workflow sequence outside of AppViewX. So where you have users customized to going to a catalog instance like Remedy or ServiceNow to initiate requests for hardware, services, etc., you can continue to leverage that same behavior by creating the service catalog item that would then make the REST API call to the defined visual workflow, which has been tailored to your needs in the AppViewX platform. And again, you have full capability to continue to integrate incremental steps with ServiceNow, for example, to identify change management ticketing, validate with service request items or request items that have been initiated also in a ticketing system, as well as the infrastructure component items, such as the load balance firewall, DDI platforms, DNS infrastructure, and complete the full application delivery automation. What other questions? We have one, does AppViewX have any support for declarative APIs such as Puppet and F5's AS3? I know for certain it does have compatibility for Puppet and other configuration management utilities, Ansible being another. That's a very popular one that several of our customers have leveraged. The F5 AS3s, I'm not that familiar with the topic or concept of AS3s, but as far as the F5 REST API, declarative API, there's a large number of existing playbooks that associate to declarative structures within YAML playbook series. The AppViewX does leverage the REST API communication mechanism when deploying configurations and managing F5 platforms. So yes, it is leveraging the API infrastructure when it comes to declarative statements. Yes, you're defining in your visual workflow what the declarative state of the configuration set is, and you're pushing that individual expression into the infrastructure. You're also able to fetch the current configuration state either on a routine interval of daily, so that happens automatically with the system. It performs it once a day by routine default, and then on demand, you can fetch configuration from, say, an F5 appliance device, and then that is going to instantly reflect whether or not the configuration is conforming to the defined declarative state of the configuration set. So hopefully that answers that question. See, I think we have one other question here. Could you go into a little detail about how AppViewX would work with Puppet? So the integration with Puppet is defining the actual Puppet server platform itself and the path where the Puppet scripts are located. So once you're defined the ability to authenticate with it, so whatever service account, if you want to define for the Puppet server and the server instance itself, it will log in and discover the scripts that are defined in the path that you specify as your script resource. Those are then imported and then made available within the library of the AppViewX visual workflow catalog. And the same applies to Ansible. So where you have playbook structures, you would allow the AppViewX system to connect to the Ansible platform, defining where your playbook resources exist within the path definition, and it will discover each of those YAML file instances, pulling them into the collective catalog, and then representing them each as individual playbook sequences that you could then drag and drop into the visual workflow palette and continue to orient other tasks, if desired, around that individual task sequence. What other questions? Just a moment here. I've got a longer question I'm reading, so bear with me. Some basic questions, two of them that I'll read off here really quickly. How do you communicate with network devices? I mentioned a moment ago, it's going to communicate with individual network devices via HTTPS and the RESTful API where available on specific devices, or SSH. The only instance where we utilize an agent that needs to be deployed is going to be relative to Windows server platforms. Next question in that sequence was, how can you deploy the AppViewX application? The AppViewX application is provided in an OVA or virtual machine image instance, both KVM, OVA, or can be applied to your own Linux-based server platform via script installation. So it will install the stack on your provided virtual machine instance or hardware instance. The easiest deployment, either cloud or on-prem, is via the virtual machine deployment, OVA KVM build instance. We have another question here. Beside the application point of view, can we recommend the network automation as replacement of Turin or AlgoSec in order to automate the network request automation, which would be like analyzing the policies taken from the firewalls and suggesting a policy to achieve the goal and pushing that policy related to firewalls. Yes, I've actually worked with a customer that had, this was an MSO, and they had a large, very large number of firewall devices. They were trying to identify overlapping or congruent policy structures, and they were looking to reduce and minimize the number of policies throughout their entire infrastructure. We had created a workflow that would collect and evaluate all of these policies throughout their infrastructure and provide them with the application-centric view for these policies. So that would help them to identify that policy 1 and 4 happen to be overlapping in their statements. They had either defined for the same destination, source, address range, and service port, and thus we could combine those into a single policy. And that was the effect of that particular workflow. It would identify 2 candidate policies as being alike, and then create an additional policy to aggregate the 2 into a single, and then remove those overlapping policies. I think that was what the point of the question was getting at. So feel free to correct me if I missed the opportunity to answer that correctly. One last question that I see here is, just replying with that answer to my question. So I'm not sure if that was from the same participant or same panelist, but that's all the questions I have at this moment. What other questions? Okay, well, it seems we have no other questions. I would like to share information regarding our additional upcoming webinars as we continue to focus on network automation and orchestration. We'll be hosting another on September 25th at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 Eastern. So I hope that many of you, if not all, can join again as we continue our discussions about network automation. And of course, we invite anyone that is interested in viewing a live demo of the platform to please reach out to us. We can be reached at appviewx.com. I believe it's /info, but don't quote me on that. I'm not 100% sure. And we will definitely entertain any invitations to continue the discussion. So with that, my name is Glenn Gray, again, Solutions Architect with AppViewX, and I want to thank you all for joining. Alan, any comments, closing comments?
That was great, Glenn. Thank you. And again, thank you all for joining. We hope to see you in our next webinar. Good day to you.